Here's something worth knowing. Most compliance failures don't happen because organizations misunderstand a single legal provision. They happen because nobody mapped how data actually flows through the business, from the moment it's collected to the moment it's finally erased. Legal knowledge without operational mapping is like knowing traffic rules without ever looking at the actual road. In this chapter, we shift from legal text to practical application, walking through the complete data lifecycle in action, collection, notice and consent, processing, how individuals exercise their rights, grievance redressal in practice, sharing with third parties, retention, breach response, erasure, and nomination and post-life rights. By the end, you'll be able to trace a single piece of personal data from the moment it enters your organization to the moment it leaves, and identify exactly where DPDP obligations attach at every single step. Let's follow that journey together. Let's start with a simple but powerful mental model. Every piece of personal data your organization touches has a life cycle. It's born the moment it's collected, it lives through processing and use, and eventually it dies through erasure or anonymization. DPDP attaches specific obligations at nearly every stage of that journey, not just at the beginning. I often ask compliance teams a deceptively simple question. Can you draw me a map of exactly how a customer's data moves through your systems, from sign-up to deletion? More often than not, there's an uncomfortable silence. Most organizations understand individual compliance requirements in isolation, but rarely visualize the complete journey end to end. Think of it like tracing a river from its source to the sea. You might understand individual sections brilliantly, where it's shallow, where it floods, but if you've never traced its complete path, you'll miss exactly where pollution enters, or where a dam might be needed most urgently. That's precisely the exercise this chapter walks you through. Rather than treating collection, consent, processing, and erasure as separate legal topics, we'll follow one continuous journey, seeing how each stage genuinely connects to the next and where the real compliance risks tend to cluster in practice. Every data lifecycle begins here: collection, the very first touchpoint where personal data enters your organization's systems. Think about how many different channels this actually happens through: website forms, mobile apps, customer service calls, physical documents later digitized, even data purchased from third-party brokers. Here's a question worth sitting with. Does your organization collect data proportionate to its actual stated purpose, or does it default to collecting everything possible, just in case it's useful later? I reviewed a client's sign-up form recently that asked for date of birth, gender, and annual income, for a service that genuinely only needed an email address and delivery location. Think about this using our library analogy from Chapter 1. A good librarian asks only what's needed to issue a book. Excessive collection isn't just a compliance risk, it's genuinely unnecessary business liability. Every extra data point collected is another point of exposure if a breach ever occurs. I remember a founder pushing back when I flagged this exact pattern. But what if we need that data later for something? That mindset itself is the problem DPDP is designed to correct. Collect what you need now for a clearly defined purpose, not speculative future use cases you haven't even planned yet. So here's a practical exercise worth running on your own systems. Pull up your primary data collection form right now, and for every single field, ask honestly, is this genuinely necessary for the stated purpose? Anything you can't confidently justify is exactly where lifecycle risk begins accumulating. Once you've decided what to collect, the next lifecycle stage kicks in immediately: notice and consent, exactly what we studied in depth back in sections 5 and 6. But here's what's different now: we're looking at this operationally, not just legally. Think about timing specifically. Notice must happen before or at the point of collection, not buried in a lengthy terms of service document users skim past without reading. I worked with a client whose consent flow initially collected data first, then displayed a privacy notice afterward, technically present but sequenced entirely backward from what genuine informed consent requires. Here's a real-world analogy worth considering. Imagine a restaurant that serves you a meal, then hands you the ingredient list and asks if you're okay with what you just ate. That's absurd, right? Yet that's essentially what happens when notice follows collection instead of preceding it. I also want you to think about layered notice design. Rather than one overwhelming wall of legal text, effective notice often works in layers: a brief, clear summary up front, with genuine detail available for anyone who wants to dig deeper. Think of it like a nutrition label: quick key facts visible immediately, full ingredient detail available if you actually want it. So here's the operational question worth asking. At the exact moment your systems collect personal data, is clear notice genuinely presented first, and is consent captured through a real, deliberate action, not a pre-checked box or buried default setting? That sequencing discipline is where many organizations quietly fail this stage. Once data is collected with proper notice and consent, it enters the processing stage, the actual use of that data for whatever purpose was originally stated. This is where the principle of purpose limitation, which we introduced back in Chapter 1, becomes operationally critical, not just theoretically important. Think about a real scenario. A ride-hailing app collects your location data for the specific purpose of matching you with nearby drivers. If that same location data then gets used internally to build detailed movement profiles sold to advertisers without your knowledge or separate consent, that's a direct purpose limitation violation, even though the original collection was entirely legitimate. I worked with a retail analytics client whose data science team wanted to use customer purchase history, originally collected for order fulfillment, to build predictive models for entirely unrelated cross-selling campaigns. Their assumption was, we already have the data, so we can use it however helps the business. That's exactly the mindset this stage exists to correct. Think of processing boundaries like the terms of a rental agreement. Just because you're allowed to live in an apartment doesn't mean you can use it to run a commercial business from the same space, without renegotiating those terms explicitly with your landlord first. So here's a practical discipline worth building into your organization's processes. Before any new use case for existing data gets approved internally, ask explicitly, does this new use fall within what we originally told the data principle, or does it require fresh notice and consent? That single checkpoint prevents most purpose limitation violations before they ever happen. We covered these rights legally back in Chapter 5, access, correction, erasure, nomination. Now let's look at them operationally. How does an organization actually build systems that let individuals exercise these rights in practice, not just on paper? Think about a real test I run with clients constantly. Can a customer right now find a clear way to request their data, correct an error, or ask for erasure within 3 clicks or less? If the answer involves hunting through nested settings menus or emailing a generic support address that takes weeks to respond, that's a lifecycle failure, regardless of what your privacy policy claims. I worked with a telecom client whose rights exercise process initially required customers to visit a physical store with photo identification for a purely digital data access request. Think about how disproportionate that felt, digital data collected instantly but requiring physical presence to access it. We redesigned that into a genuine self-service digital flow. Here's an analogy worth considering. Think of exercising rights like a bank's ATM versus requiring an in-person branch visit for every single transaction. One genuinely respects your time and autonomy, the other creates friction that quietly discourages people from exercising rights they technically have. So here's the operational question worth asking honestly. If you personally tried exercising each of these rights against your own organization's systems today, how smooth would that experience actually be? That honest self-test reveals more than any compliance checklist ever could. We studied the legal right to grievance redressal back in Section 13. Now let's examine what makes this work operationally, because a well-designed legal right can still fail completely if the actual process behind it is broken or genuinely inaccessible. Think about the difference between a grievance mechanism that exists on paper versus one that genuinely functions. I once tested a client's grievance process myself, submitting a realistic test complaint. It took 11 days and 3 follow-up emails to get any substantive response. Technically, a mechanism existed. Practically, it failed the spirit of what this provision requires entirely. Here's a scenario worth considering. Imagine a customer whose erasure request went unfulfilled for months, finally escalating to a formal grievance. If your organization's response is defensive, slow, or dismissive, that customer's next step is escalating directly to the Data Protection Board. Exactly the outcome effective internal grievance handling exists to prevent. Think of grievance redressal like a restaurant handling a customer complaint about their meal. Handle it quickly, genuinely, and generously, and you often retain that customer's trust. Handle it poorly, and they don't just leave, they tell others, or in this case, escalate formally to regulators. So here's a practical benchmark worth setting for your own organization. What's your actual measured average response time for privacy grievances today? If you don't know that number precisely, that's itself a meaningful gap this lifecycle stage exists to close. Personal data rarely stays contained within a single organization's systems. It flows outward constantly to payment processors, cloud hosting providers, marketing platforms, analytics tools. This life cycle stage addresses exactly that reality: what obligations attach when data moves beyond your immediate control. Think about a practical scenario. Your e-commerce platform shares customer addresses with a third-party logistics company for delivery. That's the data fiduciary, remember, working with a data processor. But what happens if that logistics company then misuses that address data for its own unrelated marketing purposes? Your organization still carries meaningful accountability for that downstream failure. I worked with a client who'd shared customer data with over a dozen different third-party vendors, analytics tools, marketing platforms, customer support software, without ever formally documenting exactly what data each vendor received or why. When we mapped it fully, several vendors held far more data than their actual function genuinely required. Think of this like lending your car to a friend. You're still responsible for ensuring they're a licensed, capable driver before handing over the keys. You can't simply claim ignorance if something goes wrong afterward. The same accountability logic applies to sharing personal data downstream. So here's a practical audit worth running regularly. List every third party your organization shares personal data with, and for each one, ask, do they genuinely need this specific data for their stated function, and do we have appropriate contractual safeguards governing exactly how they use it? How long should your organization actually keep personal data? This lifecycle stage addresses exactly that question, and the honest answer is considerably shorter than most organizations currently practice. Retention should align directly with the original purpose, plus any legally mandated minimum periods, nothing more. Think about a common failure pattern I encounter constantly. Organizations default to keeping everything indefinitely, just in case it's useful someday, treating data storage like an infinite, cost-free warehouse. But every retained record beyond its genuine purpose is pure liability, sitting there, waiting to be breached, with zero corresponding business benefit. I worked with a client whose customer database still contained full records for accounts inactive for over 7 years, well beyond any tax or legal retention requirement. When I asked why, the honest answer was simply, nobody ever built a process to delete it. That's not a legal decision, that's operational neglect. Think of retention like food in your refrigerator. Keeping everything indefinitely doesn't just waste space, eventually it becomes actively harmful if consumed. Personal data works similarly. Past its genuine useful life, it becomes risk rather than value. So here's a practical starting point worth implementing. Build an actual retention schedule, mapping each data category to a specific justified retention period, then automate deletion once that period expires. Manual, ad hoc deletion simply doesn't scale, and it's exactly where most retention failures happen in practice. Despite genuinely good faith efforts, breaches still happen, and this lifecycle stage addresses what must happen next: timely notification to both the Data Protection Board and affected individuals, communicating clearly what happened and what's being done about it. Think about why speed matters so critically here. The longer a breach goes undisclosed, the more damage compounds, stolen credentials get used for fraud, exposed personal information gets exploited further, and affected individuals lose precious time to protect themselves, changing passwords, monitoring accounts, watching for identity theft. I worked with a client who discovered a breach internally, but spent nearly 3 weeks debating internally how to frame the announcement, worried primarily about reputational damage. That delay itself, independent of the breach's original severity, created additional compliance exposure and eroded customer trust further once discovered. Think of breach notification like a building fire alarm. The alarm's entire value depends on immediate activation. A fire alarm that waits 3 weeks to sound because building management wanted to assess the situation carefully first defeats its entire protective purpose. So here's a practical discipline worth building now, before you ever face a real breach. Does your organization have a pre-built, rehearsed breach response plan ready to execute immediately rather than improvised under genuine crisis pressure? That preparation gap is exactly where many organizations fail this critical lifecycle moment. So we've talked about retention, which is about time. Now let's talk about erasure, which is about doing it. And there's a gap between those two that swallows most compliance programs. Section 12 gives the data principal the right to request erasure, and Section 8 requires you to erase when the purpose is served. Sounds straightforward. Now let me show you where it breaks. A client of mine got an erasure request and their team was proud. They deleted the customer record from the CRM in under an hour. Job done, they said. So I asked a few questions. Is the record in your data warehouse? Yes. Is it in the analytics copy? Yes. Is it in the SMS vendor's system? Probably. Is it in last night's backup? Definitely. So had they erased anything really? They'd deleted one copy out of 6. Here's the analogy I use. Erasing data from your main system is like tearing one page out of a book when the photocopier has already been running for 3 years. The page is gone, the copies aren't. And that's exactly why data mapping keeps coming back in this chapter. You cannot erase what you cannot locate. Every erasure obligation ultimately rests on knowing where the copies live. So here's your takeaway. Before you promise anyone erasure, ask yourself honestly, do I know every place this data exists, including backups and vendors? If not, that's not an erasure problem, that's a discovery problem, and it needs solving first. Now here's a provision that genuinely surprised people when the Act came out, and it's one that I find quite thoughtful. Section 14, the right to nominate. Let me explain what it does. A data principal can nominate another individual to exercise their rights on their behalf in the event of death or incapacity. Think about what that acknowledges. Your data outlives you. Your relationship with an organization doesn't simply end when you do. Let me make this real. Imagine a person passes away. Their family knows there was a policy somewhere, a DMAT account somewhere, a subscription still charging a card every month. Who can ask the company what data they hold? Who can request correction of a wrong record? Before this provision, the honest answer in India was nobody, and good luck. Section 14 gives that grieving family a legal doorway. Now let me ask you the operational question, because this is where it gets interesting. Does your onboarding form even have a nomination field? Does your support team know what to do when someone calls and says, "My father has passed away, I'm the nominee"? I'll be honest, in most organizations I've assessed, the answer to both is no. So here's the point I want to leave you with. Nomination looks like a small clause, but it's the Act telling you that the lifecycle doesn't end at the last transaction. It ends when the data does. So let's bring this chapter together, because we've covered a lot of ground. Here's the single idea I want to stay with you. The DPDP Act isn't a rulebook you check once. It's a shadow that follows your data. At collection, it asks, do you need this? At notice and consent, it asks, did they really understand? At processing, it asks, are you still inside the purpose? At rights and grievances, it asks, can you actually answer? At sharing, it reminds you that you can delegate the work but never the responsibility. At retention and erasure, it asks, can you prove it's gone? At breach, it asks, who did you tell and how fast? And at nomination, it reminds you the story continues after the person doesn't. And did you notice the thread running through all of it? Data mapping. Every single stage collapsed back to one question. Do you know where your data is? That's not a documentation exercise. That's the foundation everything else stands on. Now, if you'd like to go deeper with a structured course on this, with role plays, quizzes, and practice tests, the link to our Udemy course is in the description below. Do subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. And the YouTube playlist link is also in the description. Click on it and you'll get the complete list of every video in this playlist. In order, I'll see you in Chapter 9, where we look at significant data fiduciaries.